I had one for each of you, but you can have that one. That's fine. That could be the extra one, but I think Dad already has one for you. And I know I was late. Yeah, Daddy already has one, I think.
All right, good morning. Just a couple of quick things before we get going. If you are watching online, I know the sound is terrible. You might not even be able to hear me talking. We're working on that. It's just the smart people who understand this. We're on vacation this week. Thank Pastor Campbell. We're working on that. We know the sound is not super good. Hopefully you're catching some of the room sound, some of that mic, so you can hear it a little bit. So that's that. Second thing is, if you were not here last week, Pastor Campbell kind of went through the introduction and chapters 1 through 3. So today we're looking at chapters 4 and 5, and then we'll kind of continue on through the book as we go. If you don't have the book, but you would like to read it, you can actually just go online and Google Chesterton's Orthodoxy PDF, and it'll pop up as a free PDF. You can just read it right on your computer screen if you want. Or you can order the book. It's not super expensive either. I just printed out chapters 4 and 5 for me for this week, so I can have them right here in front of me instead of in on my computer. Why don't we pray, and then we'll get going. Father, we thank you for all the gifts of life that you shower upon us. We thank you for the rest that you give us, the nourishment you give us in our daily bread. But we also thank you for the rest that we have in Jesus. We thank you, too, for this beautiful creation that you have given us, the wonder of it all that we're going to hear about a little bit more during this class. All of this we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. So I'm going to begin by saying something that I probably shouldn't say, but I am utterly unprepared. Not because of a lack of preparation, but because even after reading chapters 4 and 5 twice, even after printing off like 15 different people's analysis and study guides and everything, there is just so much there. I've never read anything by him at all in my entire life until this book. And I've only read up to chapter 5 that we're talking about today. So if you ask me about chapters 6 or 7, you're going to have to wait till next week and ask Justin, because and he probably knows this book far better than I do. So we'll come back next week for the expert. As we look at it, I want to echo some of the things that Pastor mentioned last week too. And those of you who are reading it probably picked up on this too. Is it's the kind of book that you want to read like 6 times and you feel the need to underline everything, because every sentence feels like a quote. Like you read the sentence and you go, oh wow, now I want to stick that on my refrigerator. And then you read the next sentence and you're like, oh wow, I want to stick that in my Bible. And then you read the next sentence, like, oh, I'm going to highlight that one. And before you know it, you've underlined and highlighted the entire page, and you think, well, what's the point of that? The whole thing is highlighted. And that really is how this goes forward. And again, Pastor mentioned this last week as well. If you're familiar with reading C.S. Lewis, it kind of has the same feel of it. As Lewis in Mere Christianity kind of gives a picture of how he kind of evolved and kind of his understanding, and then how all of a sudden that kind of jives with Christianity. Chesterton does the same thing. There's that great illustration we heard last week. I think it was in the introduction or one of the early chapters where he talked about the illustration of the man who sailed off from England looking for some new land, and then he gets turned around and ends up back in England, and he's like, wow, this is a great discovery, but he's really right back home where he started. And for Chesterton, his exploration of faith and trying to figure out life was kind of like that. He set out to find something, and then he got circled right back, and he realized that what he found was nothing new. It was really the Christian doctrine. And he kind of rejoices in that as we see him go forward. Again, as much as I did read through this and try to prep the best I could, the guy's a lot smarter than me. And so I'm going to pull different things out of this. Some of the things didn't jive exactly with what these different study guides were. That's okay, because I think you're safer sticking with the stuff you like and sticking with the stuff you understand. There's plenty of stuff I didn't understand. I had to look up like 5 or 6 different words as I read because I had no idea what the word was. I can't remember what the word was, but it was a word that meant like in ancient Rome or Greece, like a giant pillar that held up part of the building. It was in the form of like a female figure that held it up. I never knew that. Now I know a new word. That's what it means. So, but I like learning, so that is a good thing as well. So, as we go through, I want to begin with kind of how he begins too. Before he really gets in chapters 4 and 5, it's kind of a transition. He now begins kind of laying the groundwork of all of his ideas and how he kind of sees the world and how it all begins to make sense. So he gives us, right at the beginning of chapter 4, he kind of gives us, for lack of a better word, kind of a preamble or a forward per se, and kind of this whole theme of talking about tradition and democracy. And I thought it fit well a little bit with kind of the world that we live in today. So I just wanted, he only touches on it quickly, so I wanted to touch on it quickly as well. And really, and again, I'm not talking the way that the people that analyzed it did, or even the way he did. I'm just kind of putting it in my own brain and letting it come out the way that I kind of processed it. The importance of giving everybody a voice, whether it is the people who are alive today or the people who unfortunately died at one point in history. That the people in the past, they deserve a voice as we try to navigate the present time today and go forward. And so when he talks about democracy, the people working together today, and also about tradition, the people of the past, he brings those two together into one thing and says these two things together have a voice and kind of helps him process what life is like. I wanted to read one. I have all these little notes on where to find these quotes. But here is one quote about that before we kind of get into the heart of chapters 4 and 5. Tradition is only democracy extended to time. Tradition means giving votes to the most obscure of all classes, our ancestors. It is the democracy of the dead. Tradition refuses to submit to the small and arrogant oligarchy of those who merely happen to be walking about. All Democrats object to men being disqualified by the accident of their birth. Tradition objects to their being disqualified by the accident of their death. Democracy tells us not to neglect a man's good opinion, even if he is our groom. Tradition asks us not to neglect a good man's opinion, even if he is our father. So I liked the way he talked, and I liked how he kind of brought that all together in that paragraph. So I wanted to kind of share that with you before we got cooking is the main thing. So chapter 4, anybody who's read chapter 4, chapter 4 is, he begins it by talking all about what? Kind of something very strange. Fairy tale. Yeah, and he calls it kind of his philosophy of elfland. And so he says, when he begins to look at the world, his view of the world really gets its foundation and how he understood fairy tales. And he says it kind of made sense for him as he went forward. And I have to say, I'm right there with him. When he looks at the world, the people of the world, call them the scientific community, or those who put a lot of weight on reason and understanding things, there is that view of life. But then in his view, if he's looking at it from the context of a fairy tale, is that in his world, something exists that doesn't exist in the real world. What exists in fairy tales that we don't often talk about existing in real life? Magic. Yeah. And he says, so when he thinks about fairy tales, magic exists. And so he takes that and transplants it into the real world. And you might think, you're probably sitting there thinking, if you haven't read the book, wait a minute. I thought this was a Bible class. Why are we talking about magic in the world? But the reality is, when he looks at the world, he is willing to say that there are some things that I can't make sense of, that I can't reason out. They are a mystery to me. Whereas many of these logical thinkers, people who put everything into reason, this kind of scientific world, they say everything can be explained to the point that, and I didn't, again, I wish I could just read the whole book to you because it's just quote after quote, it's a beautiful thing. He talks about how they see two things that have no relation to each other happening one after another. So then they call it a law. This is what must always happen. So he'll use an illustration like, well, a tree grows fruit. So there's the law. Or if somebody shakes the tree, the apple is going to fall to the ground. That's the law of gravity. Right? Those things necessarily happen. Chesterton looks at it and he says, well, I don't think that is a law in the real sense. Who's to say that when you shake the tree, the apple might not float away? Who's to say that a tree can't, instead of growing fruit, grow candlesticks? And he says, fairy tales do not throw all reason out the window. It's still there. So, for example, he uses the example of Cinderella. He says Cinderella's stepsisters, her ugly, mean stepsisters, they're older than her. So, by necessity, Cinderella is younger. Fairy tales acknowledge that. If you have two trees and you have another tree, you add them together, now you have three trees. Fairy tales acknowledge that, those kind of realities of what is real, those kinds of things. But fairy tales do not depend on certain things just because they seem to happen again and again and again, that's some sort of law of nature, that has to happen that way forever and ever and ever. He uses an illustration of, I can't remember the other term he uses something else, but he uses kind of the imagination test. He's like, you can imagine a tree growing candlesticks. Can you imagine that? Like in make-believe world? Sure, I can imagine it. Or I can imagine a bus flying. I can imagine that. But can we imagine 1 + 1 equaling anything other than 2? Not really. And until I read that, I was like, well, yeah, of course I can. But I was like, well, not really. You know, if there's 3 guys and 3 horses, we know that you can count how many legs are all involved in that process. There's no arguing that. He says, fairy tales don't give that up. Fairy tales just refuse to say that something is for sure necessarily going to happen just because we've seen it happen again and again and again and again. And he kind of goes back and forth with that. But what I want to do is I want to go to the end of chapter 4 and kind of work backwards. So we actually have the book. It's actually the very last paragraph of chapter 4 because he kind of succinctly summarizes his entire argument through the entire chapter in the last paragraph, which I must say, I was very irritated when I got to the end of the chapter because I thought I should have just read the last paragraph first. That would have been much easier to understand. So I'm going to go, and you'll see there literally says first, second, third, fourth, and last. We're going to look at each of those individually as we go, talk about them for a minute and kind of make our way through chapter 4 that way. So I'm going to begin reading at the very beginning of that last paragraph, and then we'll take each point along the way. Thus ends the unavoidable inadequacy, the attempt to utter the unutterable things. These are my ultimate attitudes towards life, the soil for the seeds of doctrine. These, in some dark way, I thought before I could write and felt before I could think, what that we may proceed more easily afterwards. I roughly recapitulate them now. I felt my bones first, so here's the first one, that the world does not explain itself. It may be miracle with a supernatural explanation. It may be a conjuring trick with a natural explanation. But the explanation, the conjuring trick, if it is to satisfy me, will have to do better than the natural explanations I have heard. The thing is magic, true or false. So he says, when he looks at the world, this idea that the world is going to explain itself, he doesn't buy that. He doesn't buy the idea that we can say it's a law, that every time that apple falls from the tree, it's going to drop straight to the ground. He says we're missing the bigger, more amazing things. A little later on, he talks about a nose. He says people might look at somebody's nose and say, wow, that's an amazing nose. So look at that person's nose and be amazed by it. It's so small, or so big, or so strange. He says, his mind, he looks at a nose and says, holy cow, a nose. Just a nose in general is an amazing thing. And he says sometimes when we're looking and make all these laws about life, and yeah, this is going to happen, that's going to happen, this is going to happen in that order, we almost kind of get in this monotonous kind of, and we don't recognize the miraculous aspect of it. What I found with Chesterton as I read him, especially these two chapters, is that in some ways I think he and I are kindred spirits in the sense that we have this childlike wonder of the world. He looks at the grass and he would say, the scientist says that has to be green, just by the laws and chemical, it has to be green. He says, well, maybe it didn't have to be green. Maybe it could have been pink. Maybe it could have been blue. But it's green. And when he thinks of, I'm going to be jumping all over the place here, but when he thinks about that, he thinks, well, if it's green, maybe it's magic. Now, when I say magic, don't think magic like real. I'm coming back to the fairy tale again and again and again. That someone did something to purposely make that grass green. And we all really like green grass. It works out really well. It all works out perfectly together. Which then down the line leads them to say, well, wait a minute. If that grass is magically green by the choice of someone or something, there must be a someone or something. Now, if that sounds familiar, if you were in the C.S. Lewis class, remember kind of some of his logic as he went down. The whole thing of, and Chesterton gets this too, that, if there's good and evil in the world, and we can judge that, then there must be something else higher than the world to judge what good and evil is. And you kind of hear him kind of going through that process as he goes through. If anybody has comments on anything as we go, just shout out or raise your hand or shoot at me. Whatever you will, don't shoot me. Shout out at me. And so when we look at the world and we think everything has to be exactly the way it is, and we can define that by laws and nature and everything, we really do lose the wonder of it all. And he uses examples of, a rose is red by design. So somebody decided that rose is going to be red. It didn't have to be red. And he sees the wonder in all of that. And he says the scientist, the person who leans so much on logic, they're missing out on the beauty of creation and the loveliness of this world. And I think that's a beautiful, beautiful thing. Some other examples that he gives and some that he doesn't give. If you think about the sunrise, we just assume the sunrise is going to come up every day, right? That's what it does. The laws of nature say the sun is going to rise. But he uses it, and this comes up again later, but again, I'm jumping around. He sees the sun rising almost like God doing poetry. But then he kind of steps that back and he says, no, not like poetry, but God actually designing a play. And then God sees it happen, and he likes it so much he wants it to happen again. And the next morning he says, that was so great, let's do it again. And then God creates this beautiful thing that we call creation for our enjoyment and for the beauty of it all. And as I was reading this, I was like, yes, that's exactly, you might be surprised, that's exactly how my brain sees the world. Pure wonder. When you look at the ocean and the tides coming in and out, well, a scientist will tell you, well, that's because of the moon and how the tides work and gravitational pull. I know all that. But look at the stinking ocean. It's amazing how it does. The fact that there is an ocean, the fact that over 70% of the earth is covered by water, and how this all came together exactly the way it is. They give us pictures of the universe and how this has to happen or this has to happen. The Earth in our solar system, it has to sit right where it is. A little bit too farther this way, a little bit too farther this way, and it wouldn't sustain life. It is right where it needs to be. And to be able to see the wonder of that and go, wow. And I think Chesterton saw that. And so when scientists would try to give him explanations of how everything worked, he said, sorry, I don't buy it. Well, I look at it, I see magic. There's something else going on here just besides rational thought.
This reminds me of, I don't know if anybody knows the name Richard Klein. He was a famous physicist. He worked on the atom bomb. And when he was young, his father, he put a bowling ball in a leg, and he said, what's going to happen if I pull the leg? And, you think the lift is going to go with the leg, and it doesn't, because the bowling ball spins in the opposite direction. And he can describe, physicists can describe what happened with that woman, but nobody knows why.
Yeah.
And this seems like a similar thing,
Mhm.
The physicists and the scientists can describe and give you the laws, what he calls laws, but they don't know why the laws are there.
Right. Yeah, and I don't think he's necessarily saying that, this is not, if you read it, he's not saying this at all. He's not saying just to throw out all of these things. He's just saying that that doesn't explain everything. There is something else beyond that doesn't make sense. Now, I want to pause there for just a second, because I want to make sure we keep coming back to seeing and he'll bring it back here eventually, but seeing the connections to Christian doctrine as we go here. So, creation, I mean, it fits right in, right? That this place didn't just kind of over the course of millions and billions of years kind of come and just accidentally end up the way that it is. Where scientists would say, well, no, this happened, and then this happened, and this is how this happened. Chesterton would say, well, no, there's something mystical, mysterious about this. And when we look at the scriptures, we have our account of creation. Made in 6 days, God rested on the seventh, and we see the beauty of it all, and the beauty of it all, and we can stand in awe of it, and recognize that this is just a miraculous, beautiful thing that we have here. At one point, and just different parts of the chapter are jumping out into my head as I'm talking, the scientist looks up at the universe and thinks about how vast it is, how huge it is. But Chesterton says the reality is that he talks about the universe as this cozy, small little thing. Because God, who created the universe, says when the artist looks at his artwork, it always seems small to them, smaller than them because they created it. And that's how God looks at all these things. The universe just seems a small, cozy little thing to him because he is the creator of all things. Again, I think of a neat way to think about it and work it through. All right, I want to move on to the second layer. Second, I came to feel as if magic must have a meaning, and meaning must have someone to mean it. There was something personal in the world, as in a work of art. Whatever it meant violently or vehemently. And again, when I can't help but have the exact same feeling when I look at this world. It is a beautiful creation. It's a piece of art. And if this is a beautiful work of art, there must be an art. Or in fairyland, if there is magic, there is somebody doing the magic. There is the fairy godmother. And we may not always understand that magic. And again, to go back to Cinderella, he uses the example of, remember Cinderella has to be back by midnight because then all the coachmen turn into mice and the pumpkin turns it back into the carrot turns back into a pumpkin or whatever. And that's just how it is. Cinderella does, Cinderella doesn't ask, well, why does it all turn back that way by midnight? Well, that's magic. Why do you even have mice that turn into men in the first place? Why do you have a pumpkin that turns into a carrot, right? That's the mystery of it all. There are some things that we're not going to explain because on this side of glory, God doesn't reveal everything. And isn't that an important element of the Christian faith too? Is that there are times in Bible classes and confirmation class where my answer has to be to a question. I don't know. God doesn't reveal that to us. There are some Christian traditions that want to try to make us believe that in this book is the answer to every single detail of life that you could ever know. It's not what God doesn't reveal any details of life. You're not going to find in Nehemiah 2 how to change a carburetor, right? You're not going to find in Matthew 6, well, should I eat frosted flakes or should I have frosted mini bread, right? It doesn't give us every answer for life in this book. This book reveals God's plan of salvation in and through Jesus. And anything beyond that, it's okay for us to sometimes say, we don't know. All right, I'm going to take my notes here. And again, this is in that chapter, he does kind of talk about creation being a sort of play. And the sun rising again and again is kind of like an encore performance. It was so beautiful the first time God said, let's do it again. But he would say there is no rule. If God is God of all creation, there's no rule that says the sun has to come up again. Now, we don't, how did he say it? We don't count on the sun coming up every day. We bet on it. Or we don't bet on it. If we don't count on it, we bet on it. Because when you see something that happens again and again and again, now most likely when you wake up tomorrow, the sun's going to come up. Yeah, I'd be willing to bet on it. But I don't count on it as a necessary law of nature that must happen as explained by the world. Because God is God. And you might wake up tomorrow morning and go, well, we'll do something different than the sun. And now some people would say, well, you're just crazy, Richard. Why do you think that way? It's a crazy moment. And I think that's how Chesterton thought too. He saw the wonder in it all. That this creation is as beautiful as it is. And God designed it that way. I think, to use another, a frog jumps and a frog likes jumping. God knew the frog would like jumping, so he made frogs to jump. He knew he would love flowers, the color of the roses, the grass, the mountains. He designed these this way as a piece of art for us. And I just thought that was phenomenal how he kind of illustrated that out. Third point. I thought this purpose beautiful in its old design, in spite of its defects, such as dragons. You know, in fairyland there are dragons, right? Come across the jet, why not something you want to have an argument, right? They keep, breathe fire, all that stuff. But it's still good to be in fairyland. To live in a fairy tale is a good thing. There's magic. There's lots of good things in fairyland. Living in this world, it's a beautiful design. He acknowledges that are there bad things in it? Yeah, there are. But it's still a really great place to live. And this is going to kind of come up a little bit more in chapter 5. He kind of jumps off this platform of pessimism versus optimism, and he kind of goes off there a little bit. Hopefully I'll talk fast enough to get there. As part of this third point, he talks about this concept of conditional joy. In fairy tales, weird things happen in order to make either something good or something bad happen. So if you do, I can't think of any particular fairy tale off the top of my head that would work for this, but if you do this, that seems like totally strange, then something wonderful will happen. Or if you do this, which seems something totally strange, then something bad will happen. So Cinderella, if you get back after midnight, guess what's going to happen? Now, you getting back after midnight in the carriage turning back, that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And so he talks about this conditional joy of things. And he says, I kind of see that in the world as well. There are things that don't make sense that joy and disappointment is dependent on. And he says that's exactly how life works in fairy tales as well. So this kind of conditional joy theory. One thing that seems totally disconnected with this thing, and yet the joy or sadness depends on that thing happening. He sees it in fairy tales and he sees it in real life. Fourth, and I like this one a lot. The proper form of thanks to it, this world, the creation of it, its creator, is in some form of humility and restraint. I'll pause there for a second. Chesterton and all the other things I've read about him leading up to this study, he's apparently a man of great humility. Prolific writer, incredibly intelligent, did all these amazing things, and he was a very, very, very humble man. We should thank God for this is great. We should thank God for beer and burgundy by not drinking too much of them. We owe it also in obedience. We owe it also in obedience to whatever made us. Now, this begins to kind of pull into the picture of how do I live in the wonder of this thing, this kind of elfland, as you would say, this real world. If all of this is happening, all this, again, I use that word magic loosely, meaning the divine work of God in this world, then how do I live? Why? I live with great gratitude, great thanksgiving. Holy cow, there's a God who made all this and makes this happen, and allows me to be here, gave me a nose, all these amazing things. I use the example with kids all the time when I think about the human body. It is spectacular, the human body. I mean, spectacular. You don't think about that every day. I'm not kidding. Almost every day, at one point, I have a pretty sad body, but I'm amazed at my body. Fingers. He could have designed them differently, but he designed them to work exactly the way that they work. Imagine if there was anything different about your hand. It wouldn't work quite right. But he made it just right. Again, the scientists, they say, well, there's a reason. This happened. And Chesterton says, no, this is too amazing. This hand is too amazing to say that this just happened by some law of nature. It is magic. It is a divine act of a divine artist that made this thing exactly the way that it is. And I say, yep, I'm right there with you, dude. I ain't buying all the other stuff. This idea that the human body came to be exactly the way it is by accident, that's more of a fairy tale than reading Genesis chapters 1 and 2. I don't know how anybody can just grasp that. It just seems ridiculous to me. And I lost my voice. We live our lives with gratitude. We live our lives with humility. We realize that there is that divine artist that's put this wondrous thing together. And we live our lives with restraint and obedience. We give thanks for beer, and one of the ways that we show God thanks for it is using restraint when we drink it. We don't drink it to excess. We enjoy the gift and use it as a gift for us. And again, I just think that's a beautiful way to think about how we live in the context of this kind of divine play that we find ourselves in. Again, just shout out to heaven. And last, the strangest, there has come into my mind a vague and vast impression that in some way all good was a remnant to be stored and held sacred out of some immortal ruin. Man had saved his good, and he gives this big illustration of Robinson. So how he saved, he said that the most amazing thing about reading through that is the items he saved from the ship after that he got to the island. Man had saved his good as Crusoe saved his good. He had saved them from a wreck. All of this I felt, and the age gave me no encouragement to feel it. All this time I had not even thought of the Christian theology. So what he means in that last one is this: is when he looks at the world, he sees it as the good in the world, the beauty in the world, and all this kind of brokenness in the world, we could say. It was kind of, it felt like it was salvaged by some sort of thing that went dramatically wrong in the past. Now, what does that sound like to you? Death and resurrection. Go even further back than that. I went even further back. Yeah, even in the fall. God created this beautiful play, this beautiful design, and then something went horribly wrong. The fall into sin. Tree and fruit, that's meant. And things went wrong. So as we look at the world today, we see this, and I talk about this with my confirmation students all the time too, is that when I look in the world, I see two things. They both start with the letter B, so they're easy to remember. I see beautiful things, and I see broken things. They're both there. I think even a non-believer has to acknowledge those two things. When you look in the world, there is no doubt there are beautiful, beautiful things. When you look out into the world, there's no doubt there are very, very broken things. And I take it a step further with the kids. I said, when you look in the mirror, guess what? You see both of those too. There are beautiful things, like your fingers, your nose, your eyes. You'll read some teen magazine, you'll talk about, what are the most beautiful eye colors, blue, green, brown. Eyes! There's eyes! The amazing creation of all that. Eyes. Forget about hands and fingers. Eyes, how eyes work. The fact that I'm able to see, and my brain can process that into pictures, and I hear, and all those together. It's phenomenal how that all works. And so he sees this world as kind of the good as a remnant of something that got messed up in the past, but there's evidence of the good still there. And I think that's true in our lives today as we look at the world from the viewpoint of a Christian, that there is broken and there is bad, And we ask ourselves, how do we navigate that? Which then leads into his very next chapter, actually, very, very nicely. So I don't need that anymore. I'll put that over there. Because I'll just get confused if I leave it up here. He goes into chapter 5, and he begins in such a way that I didn't really understand it at first. I had to read through the whole thing and read through it again and kind of look at it in pieces to kind of get a little. And I don't even know if I ever got it, but I think I did. He kind of begins by talking about, just take the example of someone who is an optimist and a pessimist. So let me ask you, how would you describe an optimist? What if someone said, "Oh, that person's an optimist," how would you describe it? Positive.
Glass is always full.
Glass is always full.
Sees the good.
Mm-hmm. Excuse me. Sees the good. Glass is always full. Sees the positive thing. It can be the most miserable circumstance, and here comes this happy, jolly Sally. Oh, you know, and sometimes you just want to punch in the nose, right? What is a pessimist, on the other hand? Yeah. I just want to punch them in the nose sometimes too, right? It can be the most perfect situation. I have a friend who, I won't name names, but they teach, and I'm not kidding, like 2 days after school gets out in summer, they're like, "Oh man, summer's almost over." Like, would you stop? I'm like, you just started. I'm like, give it a rest, enjoy it. So yeah, pessimists will let the glass is not full. The glass is not only not half full, it's empty, right? It's always seeing the worst of things. And he says there are those that people look at the world in that way. He says, being kind of just your general optimist, your general pessimist, neither one of those particularly work very well in terms of the world. He says, he kind of wants to throw those two terms out the window and talk about something different. He wants to talk about love and loyalty to life. Love of the world and loyalty to life. Because when he looks at the world, you know, he generally wanted to call himself an optimist. He sees the good in things. But he says the problem with, you know, an extreme optimist who looks at the world, they say, "Oh, the world is good," and they don't acknowledge anything bad. Well, we cannot just look at the world and say it's great. There's plenty of bad and evil in the world. It doesn't acknowledge the evil in things. And I've had to learn this as a pastor in terms of pastoral care, because I've messed it up many times. When someone just finds out that, you know, a loved one has died, and what is the first thing they need? A hug. But sometimes, guess what this don't pastor does sometimes? "Oh, don't worry." What do I say? "Oh, don't worry, they're in heaven. Don't worry, Jesus is the resurrection and the life." I'm surprised most people haven't punched me. The moment happens. What they need is they're hurting. They need to mourn. Yeah, they know. Most of the people that I comfort, they already know that. Now, granted, that doesn't mean you never remind them of that. It just might be a little bit later. They need to know the truth of the gospel, but sometimes we just need a hug along the way as well. It's okay to acknowledge that things like death are horrible. Terrible. It was never part of God's original divine plan, right? It's a terrible thing. We shouldn't have to have it in the world. But on the other hand, a pessimist, and again, taking it to the extreme, sees that the world is so bad that it's not even worth changing. There's no hope for it whatsoever. And a pessimist, and again, he takes it to the extreme of saying that, you know, someone who's always talking about how terrible everything is, and we're going to be late for the bus, and everything is that they really don't love the world. Because they see it so bad, they don't even see it as worth saving. So he wants to kind of take these ideas of optimism and pessimism and talk about, because he says, how do I love a world and yet not trust in it still? And how do I love it and yet hate the evil of it? And he talks about what it needs to be is a loyalty to life and a love of the world. for the sake of it being life and the world. We don't love things because they're extraordinary. We love things, and our desire is to help them be extraordinary. He kind of takes that analogy out in many different ways, but one that I immediately thought of was, think about how you deal with even yourself or with your child or with a spouse or a friend, or I would even say how you deal with the church. We acknowledge that there's bad things, there's brokenness there, but we love it so much and we are so loyal to it that we stay invested in it. And so he starts with this kind of optimism and pessimism, but then he moves into this kind of loyalty and love type of thing. And that's how he begins to navigate the world, seeing the good and seeing the bad of it at the same time. So again, let's jump back into Christian theology. How does that, is there anything that jumps to your head? There's something that immediately jumps to my head when I think about, well, there's bad and there's good and navigating those two things together. Every time I look in the mirror, I see a what? And a saint. Huh. How do I deal with that? How do I deal with that? How do I deal with that sinner that I see in the mirror? And how at the same time do I deal with the saint I see in the mirror? Should I be a pessimist and say, oh, what a sinner, there's no hope? And he actually uses the analogy of suicide. I don't want to dive too deep into that because that's a topic we can talk about for years and bring mental health people into it. Or I could look in the mirror and say, wow, I'm a saint, and not acknowledge any of the brokenness in me. Both would be the wrong path. He says, you can look in the mirror, and he didn't use this as my analogy, trying to communicate what I think he said, is that I can look in the mirror and say, there is a forgiven child of God, fully redeemed, worthy, an amazing creation that God values so much. I can love that creation because of who that creation is in Jesus Christ. I also can look at that person and say, that's a sinner who needs to confess his sins every day. And I can be loyal to this God who made me and love this God who made me and loyal to this idea of wanting to improve myself because of this great creation he made me to be. Without the same time, without how do I say that? Without pretending like the sin isn't there. It is there. You have to acknowledge it. You do the same thing with the world. The world is a beautiful place, a lovely place. It's also a very broken place. And when I see the brokenness, I love it enough, I'm loyal enough to want to make changes. But I still rejoice in the beauty of it all. Any thoughts or comments as I kind of hit this last little thing here? Yeah.
Would you say that you wouldn't be a saint if you weren't first a sinner, so that you could repent of it and that has you restore you?
Say that again, if I wasn't.
If you weren't first a sinner, then you could not be a saint because you would not you wouldn't ask for redemption. You would already be.
Yeah, I guess technically, if you're not a sinner, you could never be a saint. But the reality is, we're all sinners, so we all have the potential in Christ to be saints. But yeah, I guess you get. I use kind of a picture. God. If you look at the Bible and all these complete mess ups that God uses, people that God uses in the Scriptures, and you think, why does He use all these broken, sinful people? That's all He's got, right? That's all He's got. He's only got the broken, sinful guy. And Jesus came not for the healthy, He came for the sick. And so we rejoice that I'm one of the sick that Jesus came for. And let me find that last. I think I was going to read one last thing for you.
I got a comment.
Yeah, go ahead.
Kind of going back to your looking in the mirror and the saints and the sinner. What he kind of brings up in the chapter is like looking at the religious side and then the logical side. The logician or logical person would look in the mirror the whole time and be like, well, this is wrong and this is wrong. How do I fix this? How do I fix this? How do I fix this? And almost goes insane trying to fix everything about himself, but always messing it up. when you go back to the fairy tale where the religious person goes, I know I'm a mess up, and there's something in there that's going to help me be sane. So there's that letting go instead of trying to fix it.
Yeah, it is that kind of, again, that mystery. I can't fix it. I see that brokenness in me, I can't fix it. I've tried. Again, and again, and again, and I fail daily, again, and again, and again. But I can look in that mirror and at the same time say, there's a saint. A forgiven, completely redeemed child of God.
Well, you use the word forgiven, because the forgiven, when you say that I'm a forgiven child of God, that saying I'm forgiven says that you have something to be forgiven.
Mm-hmm. Right. And that whole concept, yeah, someone's got to think, and that whole concept, this is an illustration, and then I gotta stop and get late. That the whole concept of forgiveness and sacrificial love doesn't fit into the laws of nature in the scientific world. It doesn't. Survival of the fittest. Forgiveness doesn't make sense. It doesn't work. And so forgiveness in love, and I definitely didn't say this, but I think you would agree, that's magic. That's that divine thing that came from outside of us, this concept of love and forgiveness, that when I look in the mirror, I see a saint, forgiven child of God, love, created, amazing, gonna live forever. Magic. Divine work of God in and through Jesus Christ. Now again, he doesn't really connect it, kind of like Lewis did throughout the course of his mere Christianity. Again, I've only read to chapter 5, maybe he'll get there. We haven't really gotten to the Christian faith yet in his discourse. We've definitely gotten to this idea of God, a loving God, who created this world. So I'm anxious to read the rest of it because, again, I'm enjoying it thoroughly. I'm totally exhausted at the end of every chapter, but I'm enjoying it thoroughly. So have a wonderful rest of your day. Sorry if that was a little scatterbrain there. I kind of get a little scatterbrain.
It is one of those books that have like something you have to read and reread.
Yep.
When I found it helpful to read it out loud, so I could hear it.
You have to read it as kind of a conversation, because oftentimes I like to analyze each thing that I read, but then you have to get the whole thing.
It feels more like you standing up and giving a debate than writing a book.
Oh.
Yeah. How are you doing? Yeah.
Well, the kids are getting their fun back tonight sometime. 8 o'clock already. Sounds like they had a good time. Down there.
Oh, yeah. Are you guys excited for a fair week?
Yeah. Dinner was lots of food right now.
I love it.
Special guest. It's like second, third, and fourth grades. There she does the under fifth graders, the kids with the autism classes. So she has 5 kids, and I think 3 paras in herself, so 4 adults with the 5 kids.